All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Cameron Sow, and I'm excited to present here at Shy Hack Night. Thank you to the booking team for inviting me. Derek, thank you for convincing me despite my reluctance, and I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity. Um, Tonight I'll be talking about learning in AI tools as someone who thinks a lot about learning and has spent over a decade thinking about and working on issues related to learning. That's learning programming at some of the leading cultural institutions in the city of Chicago, helping small businesses create learning strategy and aggregating digital resources for learning for lifelong learners. So I care a lot about learning and I think about it critically and in the philosophic context. But tonight's talk is going to be very tangible, and at I hope to provide some insights into learning that are helpful for people, and then also draw some distinctions between learning as we understand it in human experience, and then like learning in the context of AI tools discourse. So on this page, you'll see we'll do an overview of sort of what we're talking about, some context about the paper and about the world, and then I'll get into the paper a little bit, and then share some reflections, and then a little bit about like why art is relevant and important here. And I'm going to tell some of this story through some of the artwork, and I encourage folks to ask questions as they arise. One thing before we get started, the paper gets technical in some areas. I'm going to try to keep this conversation more conversational, and so I'll need some flexibility on things that I might be more specific to in the paper. I'm going to be a little bit more conversational here. So with that, we'll get moving. Next slide. Um, so this paper is about making a contrast. So we hear the term learning used a lot in AI tools discourse, and we want to distinguish that from learning in human experience and learning as known to organisms, not because like you know this is a prior view that we need to maintain, but because we're talking about uh, designating different facts relative to how people learn and how machines learn. And so, art is a way to express ideas, and hopefully, some of the graphic elements here help to illustrate some of these ideas that are harder to state. Next slide. Okay, so my expertise is in learning. I'm interested in AI tools to the extent that they're relevant to like bona fide learning for people, and I see them as a tool that can aid people in learning, and that's important. But I'm not an expert. I'm not building, advanced computational systems. I'm, in communication with people who do. I engage with people who are experts in the field, but my expertise is in learning, and I've spent a lot of time refining philosophical views about learning, but also drawing from the available research from the related fields like cognitive science, neuroscience, psychology. A range of fields that are relevant to answering the question, "What is learning?" Next slide. And so the paper, as a working title, was an AI tools paper. But the more that I was working on it, the more I thought it prudent and wise to focus on what do we know about learning, what facts can we assert and affirm about learning, and be well grounded in scientific research from a range of fields. And so AI is important, but I think we're in a moment where learning is very, very important. And so we want to be clear on what we're talking about. Next slide. Um, and so, just to start us off, I'm going to give you the overview of the paper in a nutshell. So, learning is an everyday human behavior. Sensitivity, perception, and affect are characteristic of learning in humans. We have good reasons for hypothesizing that these traits are among those distinguishing knowing and intelligence. AI tools do not literally learn, know, nor demonstrate intelligence, and treating them as if they do hazards mistaken inference about their use and capabilities. We're going to have to deal with the effects of these tools in any case, but we should do so from a sound, experimentally verifiable theoretic position. That's a mouthful, but I want to emphasize the asterisk there because this is a theory that's comprised of hypotheses. And so it's not to say that this is the way the world is and how it's going to be, but rather, like in science, to put forth a hypothesis and then look at how we test that hypothesis and draw from resources from a range of fields and see, does this align with what we're studying? And the ideas will change over time, and that's important, which is different than a philosophic position that says learning has to be computational or learning has to be only for organisms. We really do want to keep an open mind, but we don't want to be so open minded that we're like naive or making mistakes. So, um, next slide, please. And this paper was written in the city of Chicago, and that's actually really important to some of the thoughts represented in the paper. And Chicago is a city with a noted history for learning and for the arts, and it has amazing resources for learning about learning. I think it's like the best city anywhere to learn about learning because of its rich history. Places like the Art Institute, the Contemporary Museum of Contemporary Art, the legacy of places like Jane Addams Hull House, places like the Dewey Lab School. These are all really noted places in the history of arts and in learning. And Chicago is also a global city, and that's important. Next slide. Um, so Chicago is a great place to learn about learning. And this paper was written in a context where the world is changing and learning has become more important. So this is a work, there's a lot going on. This is an earlier work, but I want to give a sense of sort of how I'm thinking about these things. So there's the sense that specialization in today's world is causing some challenges and that there's this like need to have sensitivity to the interconnectedness of nature, people, society, and then also that like wisdom is really valuable in a time like this, um, and that maybe the pace of our knowledge might be moving too quickly, and that drawing from older sources of wisdom might be helpful. But some of you may be able to make out a like sea turtle in the background. I'm just trying to illustrate the relevance of climate change as a context in the work around this paper. Next slide. Um, Also important was a changing information environment. In 2016, 2017, 2018, I spent a lot of time advocating around attention to some of those issues as social media became more prolific and we were starting to be in a world where you started to hear terms like mis and disinformation, and then there's this question about the terms themselves. The way that we that we communicate has changed, and I was thinking about these ideas, advocating publicly, at city council, at the school board, speaking to policymakers, things like that. But I was also thinking about what does a natural world tell us about how systems change, and what can we learn from the environment. And so you'll see sort of these like natural, elements mixed in, and that graph sort of refers to the idea of hysteresis, which kind of speaks to how large systems change, sometimes irrevocably. And I'll not get into that too much because I got to keep us moving along, but I just want to give a sense of how I'm thinking about these things. Next slide. And also, in Chicago, winters are an important part of any project here. And so you get a lot of time to reflect. But most notably, next slide, this paper was written in the time of a pandemic. So I have a day job, and that's my focus. I get to this stuff only as I have time. And the past few years have had a lot of life stuff, and so this paper moved forward when I had time on nights and weekends. And there was also times in the pandemic where I had prolonged periods of time to be able to reflect, to be at places like the nature preserves and think, and that was actually quite important. Next slide. Um, so this is one of the graphic works. Like, I just want to illustrate this idea of stability amidst change, and this is sort of a signifier for me in this context where during the pandemic, I was engaging a lot with the work of the American pragmatists. This is a philosophic tradition from the United States. intersects with Chicago history and the work of John Dewey in particular. And one of the ideas that John Dewey is emphasizing across his work is that stability and change are aspects of experience, and that can be helpful when we're looking at things like learning that are important to experience. No, that sounds abstract, but we'll make it more tangible as we move along. Next slide. In the course of writing the paper, I was also making artwork, exploring some of the ideas around tech and society. So this one, I hope folks recognize. There's this famous quote from Steve Jobs around, computers like being a bicycle for the mind. I'm here on, my computer, and it's been really valuable for me. But we're also in a time where society sort of, maybe in some places we're taking the advice of machines too seriously. Here you have Michael Scott in a pond. Dwight's like, "What's going on?" And I think this is maybe like a metaphor for society sometimes. But so I'm trying to illustrate the context in which this paper is being created. Next slide. And there are early ideas around like, okay, so we're saying machine learning. What really do we mean? This was before Chat GPT was released, which was a really pivotal moment for technology and society. Um, and trying to make sense of this space with visual metaphors and things like that. Next slide. Um, and writing the paper in the city was really helpful because there's a lot of space to move around. There's a lot of natural spaces. In the pandemic, there were some times of prolonged, time. I was on furlough for a little bit, so that was also a context. Was back to work pretty quickly, but still there was like limited mobility. One of the great things about Chicago is there's a ton of natural space, which helps to break up some of the pace of the city. Next slide. And so that's the context of the paper. Next slide. Um, and I want to note that the logic for the paper didn't really change much over this. I wrote this paper over years. It's 50 pages. It's like pretty, some you might say dense in some areas. To try to make it not so much, but I wrote the paper that I thought needed to be written for the context. But the logic didn't change too much. So we do know a lot about learning, and there's a lot that we can draw from as those expertise in learning to contribute to the AI tools discourse. So the structure of the paper is as follows: like, learning is a wonder of experience. It's a human behavior, and that's relevant. Sensitivity, perception, and if the term affect is new to you, just like feeling works. Sensitivity, perception, and feeling are characteristic of learning, knowing, and intelligence in humans. AI tools don't literally do these things, and that's important. And that treating them as if they do, you might make some mistaken inferences, not always, but you do run the risk. And then we have to deal with these tools and the consequences of them in any case. And so let's learn about them and keep learning in mind as it works for humans as we're talking about it. Next slide. So I'm talking about the pandemic and writing this paper and the course of the journey. A ton of work went into this paper. I cannot overstate how much work was being done in the background. So these are some of the things that I was doing. So a lot of engagement with leaders in their field, whether philosophy, engineers, folks building these systems, educators, artists, ton of research, ton of reading, listening to podcasts, watching YouTube, trying to, be aware of where the conversation was at in different circles, and sort of seeing what do we have in common, what might we clarify, and then towards the end, letting my friends and family know that the paper is almost done, which was a ongoing theme there at the end. Next slide. And the city of Chicago, I've noted, was really important. Next slide. But in particular, nature spaces like the Nature Boardwalk, where there's a lot to learn from these spaces about how nature learns, how organisms in nature learn, and also they're places of reflection. They're places to get up and walk. The embodied aspect of thinking and learning for me was actually quite important to this paper in ways that I can't get into detail, but that hopefully can be familiar to anyone who likes going on walks. Next slide. Um, And then Chicago has these really interesting spaces that are unique to the city. So if anyone can recognize this sort of image, there's a point by the Salesforce Tower where the river sections meet. So the branches of the river, and there's a lot going on there. There's boats, there's planes, there's the L nearby. There's that sculpture of the it's called Constellation, which is a public artwork. And I'm illustrating just that there's certain thoughts that you can sort of only think in certain parts of the city, and that are unique to the city, and that's really quite important. Next slide. And then it's a city of commerce, an international city, and a city of art. And I think in this photo, you kind of get all those things going on at the same time. I won't spend too much time there, but it's a global city, and that's important because of some of the ideas and people that move through this city, as far as conversation, visitors for conferences, and people who are engaging with some of these global ideas like what is AI, what is learning, what is the importance of art. Next slide. And then it is an art city. So you might recognize the bean, and it's a sculpture that you can literally see yourself in the city. And art can be a tool for thought. And in that particular piece is trying to like engage with some ideas about the quantum world and these sorts of things. I'm not going to get into that too much, but just noting it. Next slide. And then the MCA is a really important resource for the city, contemporary artists, Chicago artists, and engaging with contemporary subjects like, being raised on the internet, which was that photo there. But next slide. I'll keep us moving along. I gotta be mindful of time here. 7:30, so we'll keep moving along. And then the Art Institute is a place for study. So I'm at the Art Institute pretty much every week. I didn't go to art school. Studying uh, the people who are really sensitive to the world and expressing some of the conversations going on is really helpful in writing a paper about the importance of sensitivity and perception to learning. Next slide. Okay, so writing the paper, making artwork. The artwork is shaping the paper. If anyone's seen Mitchell's versus the Machine, you might recognize the dog. Not going to spend too much time on it, but these things are relevant, and I'll move on. But next slide. These are some of the artists that shaped the paper. I got to keep us moving along. I really do want to point to Bridget Riley and Louis Sullivan in particular, and a bunch of Chicago artists who invested time and care into conversations, and that was really valuable. So, what an awesome city. Next slide. Um, Moving towards the substance of the paper. Simplification is an important strategy in science, but things in the world are densely interconnected. And art was an avenue to reflect on some of what happens when we simplify complex things. So this piece might look more complex. I'll move to the next slide. And I want to sort of cultivate intuitions about what do you lose, what do you gain through simplification when you disconnect something from its extensive interconnections. I think that's relevant to like computational reduction, to like how you know computational technologies work. Sometimes you can express that better than you can say it, and you might see me struggling here in this part, but that's just an intuition. Next slide. um, so the paper proper, the AI tools paper, learning in AI tools. Next slide. Um, we went through the logic. I want to note that you don't have to take each section. Like you might agree with the theory of learning and disagree with the portion about AI tools. You might appreciate the theory of learning, and you don't need it. Is strongest as a orchestration, but I want to note that it's structured very thoughtfully, and I think that's important. Next slide. Um, Terms like sensitivity and perception are not easy. Um, the research and the philosophy behind it requires a lot of sorting stuff out and deciding what to include in those terms and what to exclude. But we'll talk conversationally today. So, um, next slide. Um, we're going to draw a contrast noted before. Next slide. Um, but before that, I wanted some things that I'm not saying. So I'm not saying that we're not witnessing a dramatic technological advancement with profound implications. I'm not speaking a lot to intent. I think sometimes it's relevant to point to some of the economic incentives and things like this. I'm not saying expertise doesn't matter, have its limits, mine included, okay? But we do know some things, and expertise does matter when you're making dramatic claims about learning that will shape society. So we do want to listen to people who are expertise in the appropriate fields. I'm not saying there's not a lot that we don't know about learning, and I'm not saying that it's always relevant whether AI tools learn proper. Sometimes maybe it's beside the point. Okay, they're powerful tools. Next slide. Okay, so you'll see some uh, when people talk about AI tools and they use terms like perception or like senses, often they don't say what they mean, and that vagueness, can be very useful in making um, profound claims. I thought it was important for this paper to be very clear on what I am saying and how it is grounded in the available literature and how you can approach this stuff scientifically and philosophically. But for today's purposes, you don't need to get too much into this. If you want to go there, like, please read the paper. But next slide. Some terms. When I'm talking about sensitivity, I'm talking about like human senses, how we taste, touch, see, our vestibular system for balance. These things are interconnected. And for things like time perception, all of our senses are relevant. But I mean senses, sensitivity. Uh, for perception, I'm going to talk about it in terms of awareness of changing experience. When you experience the same thing over and over, it sort of just goes into the background. And when we're in a new environment, we're perceiving things that are changing and that stand out in a way that's different than if you're just used to or habituated. Careful on language here, but um, perception I'm referring to as um, awareness of changing experience. Um, I'll not say too much more there. Read the paper. Affect is a way that we study scientifically how people are doing with respect to their bodily needs, how they're surviving in an environment. You'll hear terms like allostasis, which refers to how we budget energy for activities in the world. But for today, for now, we're talking about feeling. How are you doing moment to moment? This includes the infrastructure in our bodies that allows us to feel. Learning, hopefully, habit formation sounds familiar. If you're learning something new, you're probably affecting habits that you have, creating new ones, adjusting old ones. Hopefully, habit formation is familiar to people. Knowing, referring to inference from evidence. So, one of the things about human history is we've gotten better at methods of making inferences. Roughly, this event is connected to this other event, and by knowing one event happens, I can infer that another event happens. Um, we've gotten better at figuring out tools to help us do inference over time, but we did develop those over time. There was a time when superstition maybe reigned and there wasn't modern science, but over time, inference has gotten better, and that's relevant in making claims about knowing. Intelligence, the term like competent inquiry at work, for all three of these, I want to really emphasize how much I'm drawing from the American pragmatic tradition. Citations are in the paper, but that's relevant. So with intelligence, with competent inquiry at work, the reference here is we experience a problem in the world and we have an idea about how to solve it. And we use that idea as a means of acting in the world to solve that problem. And if we solved the problem and the idea was relevant to that process, that was an intelligent act. I'm moving along quickly because I want to keep us moving to some of the substance of the paper, but those are the terms that I'm referring to. Next slide. Okay, here I just want to illustrate organisms exist in an environment, and that's relevant. So we're interconnected with other things. You can um, talk very comprehensively about all the interdependencies of a place like a rainforest to something like a hummingbird. I'm not going to do that in this talk, but when we study things scientifically, we have a tendency to sort of divorce them from the context in which they occur. But in the real world, things are very interconnected. Next slide. And then this idea of stable change. Here, I want to talk about it in the context of learning. When you learn something new, like riding a bike, some things about your behavior stay the same, and some things change. And in the process of habit formation, you necessarily have to keep some things still and in place to be able to change in a way that's beneficial to you. Otherwise, it's just sort of like chaos, flux. So, just some ideas to keep in mind. Next slide. Um, Learning. What is learning? Next slide. Let's use an illustrative example. So, learning how to ride a bike. When you learn how to ride a bike, you're using your senses. So, you're using your vision to see where you're going. You're using your vestibular system to help you with balance. You're maybe listening to what's going on. As you're moving in space, your relative motion, you're perceiving how your body is changing, like motion wise in space, and the effects that the experience is having on you, like as you feel the experience. So is this something that's going well? Is this something that I enjoy? And if it's going well, it might be an activity that you continue to participate in. So I'm trying to illustrate through a tangible example what learning looks like in sort of an everyday experience, and note that we're talking about senses, perception, and affect, but in reality, in life, these things are very involved, and it may be more helpful sometimes to talk about them as aspects of experience or behavior, if that's a more useful term to you, than as like discrete, this is a sense, this is perception, because that's just not how organisms work. Next slide. Knowing. Next slide. I'll try to use an illustrative example. So, um, this is from the American Pragmatist works. If you hear a sound and you're not sure what it is, it creates a sense of doubt. And you're trying to figure out, what is that sound? And the red question mark is like, what's going on? And it could be a door slam, it could be a window shut. But to figure that out, you have to use observation, maybe experiment, like open a window, shut it. Was that similar to the sound that I just heard? So, like, that sensory motor activity is relevant. The experiment is relevant. There's a deep relation between experiment and experience that I'm trying to emphasize here. And to resolve the doubt of was it a door slam or window shut, you're using your senses, your perception, and feeling is relevant as you're making a determination of, yeah, it was the door slam or the window shut. And like, you know, how does that knowledge, knowing from a state of I didn't know to now I know that it was the door slam, how does that affect me moving forward? I'm cruising through these, so forgive me if I'm moving too fast, but I'm trying to be illustrative. Next slide. Intelligence. Next slide. Okay. People will say that there's not a consensus definition of intelligence, and I think that's accurate. I do, however, think that we have theories of intelligence and designations of intelligence, which I'm sort of making a distinction between definition and designation. I can't get to that here, but that are credible and that are sound and well supported by the scientific literature and philosophic work. And foresight of the consequences of events, I think, is quite well supported. But to use an archetypal example, Harriet Tubman was someone who used her understanding of the terrain and the environment in which she existed to help guide people from slavery to freedom, in a nutshell. And this is someone who had an affinity for the natural world and used her senses in navigating a constantly changing environment, perceived the world as it was changing and the threats therein to avoid them, and you know, used affect in ongoing determination of resolve to help guide people across and know how to adapt to the circumstances that were changing. I think I illustrate this a little bit better in the paper as I'm just like trying to move us along, but senses, perception, and affect are important at every phase of that journey. And the successful problem solving of getting folks to the north is, I think, as illustrative of what in true intelligence is as anything out there, particularly under constraint. Next slide. Okay, how is this different from AI tools? So on the right, I'm sort of like trying to indicate some of the complexity of organisms, and the left, I'm sort of like making this like sort of like gesture to like, well, what are we really talking about here with respect to computation? Next slide. Um, I'll be brief here because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. Even at the level of AI tools, like referring to them as like these tools, like they don't. There's already so much assumption there. At every step of the production and development of AI tools, there's extensive human involvement, and that's relevant to making claims about the device or even the infrastructure that supports it. Um, Often in AI discourse, that aspect of the tool is left out, but it is certainly relevant in assessing whether or not they learn. So whether that's at the software level, at the hardware level, at creating a prompt that's going to help you solve a problem. Um, AI tools don't demonstrate evolutionarily shaped organization. Here I'm making a connection to like organs for organisms. We Language needs to be more specific as you sort of get to other organisms, and like this ramps up in complexity a lot when you're talking about it formally, but it's important to point out AI tools aren't an organized whole. They're not composed of cells which are helping to keep an organism alive, which are helping to keep the cells alive. I'm sort of being a little bit loose with the biology here, but cells are constituent to an organism, and that's relevant to learning for humans as it affects the habits that they develop evolutionarily and moment to moment. The term senses in AI tool discourse is referring to things that are like vision, but they're not the same or even really similar conditions to uh, vision as occurring in organisms. And that's relevant not just as like what terms are we using, but what we're allowed to inference accurately as to like um, things that have vision also have certain biological features. Things that have vision, also demonstrate these other behaviors. I'm trying to draw the contrast and speak directly to facts and conditions and the consequences of those conditions as something that can help guide us in making assessments about claims for AI tools. I'm running behind, so I'm going to cruise through these other ones, but similar idea between perception and affect. So you hear the term like grounded perceptual models. Okay, perception is being used as a term of art, and the term might be useful when you're studying AI tools because you need to designate something computationally that you identify as perception. Um, but that still doesn't answer the question of is that set of conditions at the hardware, software, architecture level, is that have any similarity to organisms? Um, I'll move on here, but the points I want to emphasize additionally here are AI tools struggle with generalization in some sort of well-studied ways. They struggle with logic in some ways that other folks, I think, detail well, and then reasoning even by standards of the field. Like we're using these terms, but they don't refer to the facts that are relevant for human learning. And then there's a lot of assumptions baked into what do we mean by computation? What do we mean by engineering? What do we mean by machines? But they're still awesome tools, right? They're like, wow, like if you would have told someone a long time ago that we'd be where we're at today, they'd be like, I don't believe you. So this stuff is still impressive. Um, but I want to give a sense of some of the contrasts being drawn and the like factual basis for making those claims. And if you are more interested in the research that's supporting this from both the AI tools discourse side and from the um, like learning for humans and organisms or even more general theories of learning, please check out the paper. I'm trying to cruise this along, but I'm going to fast forward a little bit, Derek. If you could go to the next slide. Um, the next slide, I want to make sure we have time for questions. Terms of art are not the same thing as theories of the subject matter under consideration. So when you say learning, um, in the context of AI tools discourse, it's important that it's supported by a theory of learning that is testable and that is corroborated by a range of fields. But that's not really what we're finding in AI tools discourse, and I think that's important to note. Um, Learning is not learning as we use it conversationally, as like the thermostat learns. Okay, is that is that accurate taken literally? The argument of the paper is no. Um, Similar for perception and grounding. I can't detail that here because I'm running behind. Next slide. I want to point out two examples that I speak to in the paper. I'll be brief here, but the Sparks paper from Microsoft. This is a paper, I refer to it as a Sparks paper, but a research team at Microsoft made some claims that you can see here that basically the ChatGPT 4 that they were studying at the time was an example of like sparks of general intelligence. The paper doesn't support that claim. And in the paper that I read, I talk about why that is and talk about why confusing terms of art with theories of learning is not going to be as helpful to us in studying these tools. Next slide. I do want to point to Professor Pavlik, is a professor at Brown, I believe, who argued in a debate at NYU for like a conference some claims that were actually quite interesting and important, and I think sharp, but that really use terms like sensory, grounding, and understanding explicitly as terms of art, where for linguistic study, there are ways of talking about meaning or understanding that are supported by a body of scientific literature and that you could use as a basis for making claims about language models and meaning. But, you know, um, Professor Pavlik wasn't making a broader claim about are these measures answering the question about what meaning is for humans or generally. It's much more careful work. I'd encourage folks who are interested in this to take some time with that work. Next slide. Want to make sure that we have time for questions. Next slide. I'm not going to be able to get through some of this last bit, but I'll point out this question: what is grounding? Okay, you might hear this term in AI tools discourse, like how do you ground the outputs of large language models to things happening in the world? And it's a very vague term. Professor Pavlik uses it in a way that I think is more specific than other people that I've seen, and that's important. But there's still a more general question that the field doesn't have good answers to about what is grounding, and that's really important in making claims about learning and intelligence and knowing. Next slide. Um, Here's a secret. To answer that question, you really need to have a coherent logical theory and a sound philosophy of science. Um, that's an aside for folks who are interested in the philosophy, but you need to be able to say what logic is and how it relates to the real world if you're trying to answer the question of what is grounding. When we have a scientific theory, we are testing it in the world to see if it's a valid theory. And the process of science helps us to understand whether or not the theory has alignment with what we're seeing in the world. And so, can't get into that here too much, but it's an important point. Next slide. Simple language, context matters. If you take anything away from this little bit, context is quite important to the assessment of these tools and our claims about learning. Next slide. I'll have to move on, but I just want to point out that the context of the world in which we exist is relevant to how we learn about that world, and senses help us to understand the context that we're experiencing, and perception helps us to um, notice what's changing and to use what's changing as a factor in our ongoing behavior. Sorry that I have to cruise through this a little bit, but check out the paper. Next slide. Um, I won't be able to get to too much about the barriers, but just because we don't have a consensus definition of learning, knowing, or intelligence doesn't mean that we don't have a ton of really well grounded scientific work on the matter and well supported philosophic work. It may be the case that our current theories of learning might find challenges down the line, like what if aliens arrive and we have to reassess our definitions, or we find other challenging examples. Um, but to point that out as a shortcoming of theories is not to then propose an alternative theory that accounts for the facts that we do know. And any general theory of learning really needs to get the easy cases right in a way that allows for prediction, in a way that can explain and describe consistent with testable hypotheses. So, people weigh a lot on the too anthropocentric, like we're just talking about humans, and maybe that's ruling stuff out too early. But I think that's a bit of a, like, I think there's some muddying of the waters there that I worry about. And yeah, so the prestige of the field is a real challenge, I think, too. You got people making claims that go well beyond what's supported by the available work, but I can't get to that too much here. Check out the paper. Next slide. Um, there's a reference to like Greek philosophy that I just can't get to here, but that is important background to the paper. Folks who are familiar with some of the philosophic work might have an intuition about what I'm getting at there. But next slide. Next slide. Can't get to some of the philosophy here. I did put together some of the like common fallacies of AI hype for those who are interested. They're referenced throughout the paper, but I think it's important for journalists, policymakers, and people creating these tools to try to avoid some of these like well-known errors in reasoning as they're making claims. I think that'll help us reason clearly about these tools. Next slide. And some reflections. There's a lot we know about learning, even if there's stuff that we don't know. There's a lot of really well supported claims we can make about learning proper. It's good to be grounded in real world examples. And we benefit from interdisciplinary study, particularly from philosophy, which can help us to refine our thinking. And we really need more philosophic input here. A lot of the leading philosophers of today, I think, are reluctant to speak out in AI tools discourse, but there's a real need for it. Um, Next slide. And I'll close here, but learning is really important in a time of great change. And to the extent that AI tools and their study can inform learning for people, great. To the extent that they might compromise it, that's not so great. So let's be a little bit more careful in the language that we use, and let's learn from experience. I'll stop there and open it up for questions. Thanks for sticking with it.
Awesome. Thanks, Cameron. Yeah, I think we have some time for a few questions. If folks want to go ahead and type those in the chat, you're welcome to do so. I've got a first question, which is, I guess you kind of started to mention a few folks, but um, it is really hard to get a sense about what's going on actually in the AI space because there is so much hype going on and so much PR. But then there's also, it feels like there's another camp which is just like, it's all trash, it's all garbage, it's all like, BS. Who are some of the people, or where do you go to find, I think, like clear-eyed views on like the state of where AI is? Like, what are
Yeah,
some of those like podcasts or sites or places that you go that you think are reliable?
it's a good question. I think it's really helpful to look at people who are building tools that affect millions of people and listen to what they say. And how they qualify their language, and people who are producing scientific output as well. So Jan LeCun over at Meta, I think, has done a lot to temper some of the excesses of AI hype. Francois Cholet, who's a part of the abstract reasoning corpus project that is trying to help us clarify our thinking about AI tool benchmarks. Is someone who I think is speaking critically of the field, but also contributing in an important way. Professor Pavlik at Brown, I think, has a really interesting set of research that I think is helpful for folks. So folks who are both in universities and who are building stuff, and then check out some of the podcasts that they go to that they think are worth attending, and then also I think there's a value in engaging with people in cognitive science like Lisa Feldman Barrett, folks like Professor Chiramuda is someone who published a book about abstraction in neuroscience. So when people are saying like neurons in language models versus neurons in brains, like how do these differ? That's someone who speaks very clearly about this. We're still working, I think, as a society on popular media for folks, and so it's a real challenge. I don't have the best answer for you, Derek, but I think that's part of it.
Okay, appreciate that. See a number of questions in the chat. That we'll get to all of them, but one I think that actually is a question I had that Dylan just asked, which is, and maybe I'll try to tie it together, but I'm curious actually what tools you use to make your art, and then Dylan had a question of like, what do you think about the use of AI in creating art?
I think it's a tool. I think some people who use Photoshop find some of the generative features helpful. You know, I don't use generative tools in my artwork. I find Photoshop as a tool helpful, and it's an advanced tool. So that a tool is generative or an AI tool is sort of like not that like it's a tool's a tool. So I think they're more advanced tools in some ways, though, right? And I think the artistic aspect comes from the engineering of the tool and what's being prioritized by construction for the outputs and the interaction with the artist who's using the tool. And it's always important to keep the context in mind where it's not just the tool, the AI, these are tools that are wielded by people. And so I think it's fine if people use those tools. I do think there's some value in indicating when these tools are used, but I think it's something we'll have to figure out together as a society.
Cool. Well, it's 8, and I'm very tempted to ask another question, but I feel like we have to be respectful of the schedule here. But so I think we'll have to leave it here. But I guess Cameron, are you able to maybe stick around if folks want to
Yeah.
carry on those questions? Maybe we could do like a little breakout, like sort of after the we do our announcements and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for sticking around. I appreciate it. I know I had to cruise through at the end, but feel free to reach out with questions through the venue that works for you.